let's come back to the point of the pathway, as you called it, to regenerating the earth. How is that happening or not happening in Barichara?
One way that it's like very close to happening is after tourism collapsed. If you ride your bike down the highway or walk on any of the trails, you'll see for sale signs on all of the farms. Because all these local people, campesinos with very little money, and the small amount of income they got from tourism is now gone, and they're considering selling their land. But no one is going to buy the land. And no one is coming in with money. Although with the Earth Regenerators study group that we have, I'm going to start to develop a project to try to raise money and collectively buy land. But that's something we can talk about in a moment, related to the Earth Regeneration Fund and things you and I talked about before, to start to enact some of that model. But at the same time, tourism is stopped for at least a year and possibly forever. So like the schools have been shut down for all of the elementary school kids and the high schoolers since March, and it won't come back on until at least next spring. So kids are just sitting at home, playing video games, stuck in their houses, while we're in the middle of this planetary crisis. And so there's this interesting possibility to go and talk to the owners of these farms and create solidarity relationships, build cooperative models with them. And for example, instead of buying the land from them, offer to buy the land with them. And say, what would you need for us to create 5 years of security for your family if we can find some money from the outside that allows us to implement agroforestry, land regeneration on your property while we're building the new economy, because tourism may not come back. And if tourism does come back, everything we're going to do is going to be fantastic tourism stories and educational opportunities. And so we're in this place where I think people that don't have an imagination of what to do are open to those conversations. And so during this opening is our chance. And we've probably only got a few months before people will just start leaving, or they'll become so paralyzed with fear that they will cling to the old way, almost like an addiction, and we won't be able to talk to them. And so we have this window of time to work in to put ourselves on the new pathway.
So I'd love to hear you expand more on the design pathway. And also I would like to bring this back into the West a little bit, just because that's where our audience is. How does this apply? Where are the models the same and different in the West?
Yeah, the most important thing for all of this is to create material flows in our supply chains that are local. So a relocalization of economies, which has been happening all over the West, like at farmers markets, for example, all of the ways that people buy local, and how tourism is actually based on, this is the town where there's this type of art that makes baskets or a type of food or whatever. So all of that is part of this work. And that's something I think everyone can identify with in the West. But another piece that's going to be really important is to connect with indigenous lifeways. Now, where you guys are in Canada, that's not so hard to do because a number of First Nations groups in Western Canada are still there. And you can go back and look at their ways of living. Where we are in the Andes, the indigenous people were exterminated 500 years ago. And so we have this interesting challenge of a lot of existing indigenous groups in the Andes, but the ones that used to live here are gone. And so I think this is something a lot of people can relate to as well, is how do we connect to the history of the place where we live? And that's the more general question everyone can relate to. How was this land sustainable by some people in the past? And how do we recreate that for where we are now? And so for like regional scale agriculture, you can see in like in the area where you guys live, I know that just a little south of you in Idaho, there was a way of growing a type of tuber, a type of potato, that they were growing in the marshes and in the lakes. And I'm sure you could do some of that, that's more in the Cascades, but you could find some of that in the Rockies too, of ways of growing food in the kind of the range shed of mountains on the western side of the mountain ranges that are indigenous ways of growing food. So there's this question of how to connect to that. Another thing I think is really important is ownership of land, which I think that, getting back to what is the design pathway, part of the design pathway is to create patterns of integration and cooperation that work at the scale of landscapes. So working for an entire watershed, an entire mountain range, an entire fishery, that we need to organize human management around the landscapes. And one of the problems is private land creates barriers to coordination at larger scales. You got the tragedy of the commons of incentives being aligned around private land when you need incentives aligned around landscapes. And this is a real challenge for a lot of people. And it's a real challenge for us here in Columbia too. So this is just a big problem. And the design pathway becomes how do we see the patterns of living systems in our landscapes? And then how do we make our economies as much as possible around supporting the development of those living systems? It's like, how does water flow through a landscape? And how do we build soils in the landscape and things like this? And then from this, we start to see the more information economy. Like, where do people have knowledge around how to process specific local plants to make natural fibers for clothing or for medicine, food? And then you can get very complex cuisine where people travel to your region to eat special kinds of foods that local people really know how to make. Like when I go to the Northwest and I want to eat salmon, because salmon of the Northwest is phenomenal and regional. So there's a lot of this sort of stuff that is really important. But then there's also the piece of what does it mean to no longer be part of a globalized economy that is able to extract from a region and degrade it in service to private wealth hoarding somewhere else on the planet, which we can see in all of our economic systems is a big problem. So, so these are a few pieces I'm sort of talking around that are related to this work. But that's something I think we can all relate to is how do we solve these problems from one place to another as we struggle with it together?
Yeah, the interesting thing about this is that there's no one size fits all model because, right now, if you go into a store, a food store, anywhere in Canada, the things available are going to be more or less the same. And a lot of them don't even come from here because, the vegetables that are in store right now come from Mexico or United States. And so the things that actually grow locally are downplayed because it's not, it doesn't fit the economies of scale. So it might not be profitable under the current economic model to produce those things locally. So it's interesting what it looks like to rediscover those things, those local plants, local fibers, the things that make sense to produce, even the types of energy, like is it solar, is it hydro, is it something else, is it wind? The things that make sense locally are going to be different. And so it's going to be very interesting to see those different flavors of local economies emerging. And it's interesting because some of those things will apply kind of at a meta level to other places, and we can all learn from each other. But there are a lot of things that will have to be figured out in a way from scratch, or we'll have to look into the past, how they were done. And it's a unique challenge, I think.
Yeah, the way I see it is there is a shared way of thinking about design, but this way of thinking about design includes contextualization. So you contextualize the design to the context you're designing for. So you can have at the meta level, the design is about contextualization, and that's universal, but contextualization is about the specific. So that's a piece. Another piece is, and I just gave a webinar about this last weekend, we can actually design for climate change in a positive way, is we can reverse the harmful kinds of climate change at the regional scale. So where we're living in Colombia, it's a place that's becoming a desert. And in the past, there was a tropical dry forest. So if we want to bring back the tropical dry forest, we are designing climate change because we're designing away from becoming a desert. And so this is like sort of like a little mind fuck. You're like, wait a second, thought climate change was bad if humans caused it. But here we're talking about intentionally changing climate, geoengineering and all this stuff, except it's not geoengineering, it's geobiomimicry. It's collaborating with living systems as part of the design thinking, right? It's not a machine metaphor, which is what engineering is. But again, that's a universal for every place. We're designing for biomimicry. We're changing the climate for the living systems of that region, meaning we're trying to either restore a previous climate or prepare the human economy for the changed climate that's coming. And so in either case, we're designing for climate change.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought in biomimicry, because as you were saying that, I was just thinking about our conversation with Dana Baumeister on our podcast, where she talked about the principle of biomimicry, and that there's only one principle. It's that life creates conditions that are conducive for life, and we need to organize everything around that same thing. So what is the thing that we're doing that creates condition for life, for things to grow and thrive and be healthy? And it's on all levels, on individual level, family level, community level, economic level. It all has to be organized around that. And there's no other way. Eventually things become extinctionary if we don't organize them around that.
To add to that, something that's surprised me lately in my own thinking is how little kind of collaborative thinking goes into kind of building what you want to build. Like if you want to live out in nature, or you want to do some project, like it's the automatic thought process, having grown up here, is that I have to raise the funds for myself to do my own thing in a closed off environment. And there, like now that we're building this project in BC, we're involving a lot of other people, and it's suddenly like everyone's kind of realizing all at once, wow, this is really a lot easier doing this as a community than it is doing it as individuals. Like funding is not a question. It's not even a problem really when you have so many people getting involved in a project on a larger region. So, my question goes to that. What kind of changes in thinking do you think are going to be necessary, and what's going to change about people's lifestyles and ways of thinking?
One of the most important changes in thinking is going from thinking about a person who resides in a place to thinking about being a person who lives in a place. We think, if you go back to your grandparents and my grandparents, they lived somewhere. Whereas in our generation, when we were like in high school, we were looking forward to going to college and getting away from where we were, and then trying to find a place that would be like, well, I really want to live in this kind of climate or this kind of city and have this kind of job. And without knowing it, we were trying to be residents instead of inhabitants. And this is a really important difference. Another deep way of a change in thinking is the joy of playing with life rather than the drudgery of working with death. So that most of us do like life-destroying, soul-crushing work that makes us feel dead inside. And so we work with death, and then we like need to go on vacation to recuperate or do other things because it destroys us. But when you're playing with life, and I'll give an example in a moment, but when you're playing with life, what happens is you become a kid again. And I've been around two little 3-year-old girls that are giggling all the time, and it's contagious to watch little kids play. It's like you feel alive by playing with life. So my example is this. We've been digging these canals and little like ponds for catching water when the rains come. And a couple of days ago, we had friends over for lunch, 8 people in our kitchen. We're all eating together. And as all the plates are being put on the table to eat, the rain got heavy enough that one of my canals was going to have water flowing in it. So I needed to go grab my pickaxe and say, sorry, everyone, stay at my house and eat food, but I'm out of here. And I ran out into the rain to go and look at my canal to see if the water was flowing in it. Well, I was like a kid playing in a sandbox. Right? Like that was my energy. I was a kid playing in a sandbox. But the work was I was collaborating with the flow of water into a landscape. And so this feeling is so different as we're healing land. It's so different. And most of us will have recollections of it, like sometimes we felt it, but it was fleeting. And we didn't know we could have it all the time. And so this regenerative work is amazing for this. And it's a really big difference in our thinking.
This is a really important point that you bring up that I was just thinking about a lot in the last couple of days, that regeneration is all about relationship. That the way we think about doing business or doing economy or doing things, we do things to nature. Like, I'm going to go and plant this garden, and it's like a will that I'm imposing onto nature. Like, you stay like this. This is my gardening bed. This is where I'm putting the plants. Instead, we need to think about it like, I'm in relationship with what is happening here. I'm in relationship with the plants. I'm in relationship with the rain and the water flow. I'm in relationship with the climate. And thinking about it as a reciprocal thing, because nature has agency too. Like, those plants want to do something, and working with that rather than, just thinking of you being the only agent in this interaction.
What else is interesting about this is it seems to give kind of a natural or nature embedded purpose into our lives to recognize where we can help and aid with the agency of nature by spreading seeds and creating the ideal conditions for life and kind of working with things over time. Like, people who listen to this show are probably asking themselves the question, why am I here? What am I doing? Fairly often. And I've only recently been getting the experience of like working with my hands, finally getting away from the screen, doing some things in real life. And that in itself has made me feel like there's a big chunk of life that's just missing. Like there's stuff we're supposed to do that we've evolved to do that most of us don't get a chance to do. And it's the same thing as like becoming a parent. Like, there's this purpose in doing what we're naturally built to do that eases tension and eases stress and makes you like eases up that kind of existential dread, because you're doing a thing you're meant to be doing.
You're in line with life. You're creating conditions that are producing life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I want to show an example of this. So this bowl right here, these are balls of clay gathered from the clay here, and they have seeds from native plants that my wife and some of the other women in town have identified. And we made these balls of clay. They're called seed bombs, is one of the names for them. And what this is, and it has some compost in it and some spices that are natural repellents to insects and birds so that they don't eat the seeds. And the idea of this is we want to help these native plants in our desert environment. So we're just going to take these seed balls, you can see we have a bunch of them, and we're just going to spread them out across the landscape, and they will sit there for months waiting for the rain. When the rain comes, it's going to melt this clay and plant a little seed bomb. And some of these are going to turn into trees and bushes. So this is an example, right?
This is so funny.
This is a way of reversing deserts, right?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, that looked like cookies, and there's no way that I wouldn't be at your house and grab one of those and eat them. And then the other thing is that the other day we were kind of brainstorming what type of like group activities we could have on the land once we've acquired it. And airsoft was one thing. I was like, you know what? There's just such a need for physical activity and contest and teamwork and communication and strategizing and stuff. And like those kind of war games are so archetypal to masculine warrior kind of energy, which is also something that's not really given an outlet in modern life. So we were like, man, that would be awesome to have airsoft there. I was like, except the pellets probably pollute a lot. I mean, they gather over time. So I looked up, is there such a thing as like biodegradable airsoft pellets? And there is. And then my next question was, can we seed these pellets?
Can we put
so
seeds
that our
in the
war
pellets?
creates life on the land? I just love that
So
idea. We were laughing about that.
Yeah, we thought about 3D printing little seed bombs that are airsoft pellets. And so as you're, shooting stuff, you're planting seeds.
Yeah. And so it's just an example of, you see how much we're co-creating with life. what we're doing is we're giving the native plants, we're giving them an advantage in an environment where the seeds would be exposed to the sun because there's no longer forest to cover them and give them shade. All the forest was cut down about 50 years ago. And so in this place, we need a way of protecting the seeds because humans messed it up. Humans took away the protection that seeds naturally had. And so in an environment like this, we need to be very creative at finding solutions to let nature do what it would have done if we hadn't messed it up. And so these clay pellets full of seeds, which is called the Fukuoka method. It was developed by a Japanese farmer and has been demonstrated in Africa and a few other places that this works. We're going to experiment with it here. But you can see how much fun it is for kids to play with clay. I mean, clay is like how you make ceramics. It's how you make mud. Like actually our shower got clogged while we were doing this project because we had 6 kids, all of them painted. They all took off their clothes, running around naked, painting their bodies with clay. And then when they jumped in the shower to rinse off, they clogged our shower drain. And so like, this is how much fun it was to make these clay pellets. So you know, it's just a totally different way of thinking.
The brand new Future Thinkers members portal is now live. Develop your sovereignty and self-knowledge with our in-depth courses, get access to our weekly sense-making calls, join the Q&As with past podcast guests, and much more. Become a Future Thinkers member today at futurethinkers.org/members. Enter the Future Thinkers giveaway and win our brand new community membership, including in-depth courses, private calls, and more, as well as a supply of Qualia, a complete cognitive upgrade for your brain. To enter the contest, simply go to futurethinkers.org/giveaway and sign up for our mailing list to instantly get our 50-page guide on how to adapt to the future. There are many ways to increase your chances of winning. Enter the competition today.